Hi everyone, thank you for coming. We're happy to have today for our seminar Firas Mawase. Firas is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Biomedical Engineering in the Technion. And before that he did a postdoc with Johns Hopkins University and his PhD in Sheba. And so Firas is an assistant professor at the Technion, as I said, and he studies computational tools and functional imaging to study human motor control. And today we're going to hear about cortical organization doing dexterous fingers movements.
Yeah, thank you. Hi everyone. Hi Pat. So thank you, Jonathan, for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here at ELSC. So today we'll be talking about different projects that we have been doing in the last few years, which is trying to understand a little bit about the neural control of finger movement. So I'm focusing in human studies, but of course I will show you a little bit some evidences about how we get to these questions from studies about non-human primates and monkeys performing the same task that I will show you later. So if you look at that, finger dexterity is something that we employ frequently in our daily life, right? Just think about it. It's, we perform this finger movement just hundreds and thousands of times every day. And this can be, from very simple tasks like tying shoelaces up to more complex movement pattern like playing a piano instrument and something like this. And the question is that how the brain control all of these, I would say, dexterous, complex finger movement. So the ability of the motor system to control this movement is fundamental, as I said, in our human daily life, but also important for higher mammals that for survival, for example, that endowed with some ability to make this finger movement. So if we look at we look closer at this movement, I think we can appreciate that the motor repertoire of this movement can range from I would say very gross movement, just applying forces against if you wanna hold a couple of hold a cup. So you apply forces using your fingers, but you don't really care too much about the forces in each of these fingers, right? And then this go to the extreme, in the extreme side, when you need to make a precise movement. So you need to know exactly how much forces you want to apply to produce, in which direction, and then we think this individuation ability, the ability to individuate a single finger, is one of the principal or the most precise finger movement that human can do. So if you look by evolution, we know that this individuation ability, the ability to move a single finger without moving the other fingers, like this moving, pointing, higher mammals, including monkeys, they cannot really perform this single-digit pointing movements. And then if we go back to the rodent, and it's very hard, to make these small movements when they want to eat, for example. So they hold this food pellet using the paw with the entire hand, involving all fingers. So human reach peak in this kind of ability to make these dexterous movements, and this is why I'm interested in human. And I think to fully understand the neural correlate, we have to answer at least two principal questions. First is what is the neural control of the different finger functions when we talk about strength versus individuations, right? This is one of the main questions that we're going to understand. And second is looking within these functions, whether there is a difference between controlling a different direction, right? This is something that also we are interested. When I talk about direction, I mean primarily our fingers move in the flexion and extension direction. So it's upward and downward, and this is something that we are interested. And I will show you why this is important functions for human to better understand the neural control of the different directions when we make these simple yet dexterous finger movement. So answering the first question, I think we have more and more evidences showing that the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex, and the cortical spinal tract are involved in more pinch precision and precision grip versus a gross movement like a power grip. So this is a study by Roger Lemon Group in 1983. They recorded activity from pyramidal neurons when the monkey did two different tasks. The precision grip here in two different weights of these forces versus a power grip, and they showed that there's some neurons actually that are active only when the monkey does this movement compared to the other movement, right? So this suggests that maybe we have an evidence that these cortical neurons somehow might be involved in this kind of precision grip. Another study, I think this is a very classical study back in the 1968 by Lawrence and Coopers. What they did, they actually did a lesion to two groups of monkeys. One group, they did a lesion to the descending cortical spinal tract here. And then I'm showing you here the original videos that they recorded. Sorry, here. So what they found is actually when they did this kind of lesion to the cortical spinal tract, the monkey can still jump and hold all of these, the cage, all of these things, but she spent her time to make this fine finger movement. So the monkey did not really manage it or succeed in holding these apples to eat. And this suggests that, well, again, that probably the cortical spinal tract and the descending pathways of these motor cortical spinal tract involved in this fine finger movement. Then they did a different kind of lesion in different side of this of the spinal cord, which was about the reticulospinal formation. It's a different area here. And then what they found is that monkey first much more weaker. They don't have any strength power in their hands, but they still make. They can still make this. I would say dexterous finger movement. So they can still hold and pick this food pellets and eat it, but they are very weak. So in terms of like strength and forces. So this actually suggests that it probably, and there is, beyond these studies, there is now more and more evidence in stroke patients showing that lesion to different tracts, cortical spinal tract affect more our fine control, finger control, and more, reticular formation or stroke in the reticular formation area affect more the strength of the finger movement. So I think we have more evidences about these two functions, and then for me what was actually missing is whether the control of the different directions within each of these functions is controlled similarly in humans. So when we talk about directions, I mean about flexion and extension, and this is something that we do like hundreds of times every day. And the question is, what is the neural correlate of these finger movement? So why it's important to ask this question, right? What's the motivation about that? So I will show you that for human and stroke patients, actually, when they have a stroke, probably mostly in the cortical spinal tract and other areas, so they have limited finger extension, but they still have good power to grasp things. So they spend hard time to open their hands and to extend their fingers, but they can, if you open their fingers, they will I would say, not really precisely, but they can apply forces in the flexion direction. So this means that there's something different between the different directions in terms of finger movement. So I will show you a video from patients in our clinical trial. Here is his.
Let's go to the next one.
I want to close the. Sorry. Okay. So now we asked him to open and close his non-affected hand, non-paralytic hand. So it's a unilateral stroke affecting his right hand. So if you look at the left video, he can very smoothly and accurately open and close his hand with the fingers. But then when we did this we asked him to do this the same for the paralytic side. he literally cannot open his fingers, but he can grasp and hold that tennis ball by applying some forces to that direction, right? So this actually suggests that there's something different between these extending the fingers to release that tennis ball versus grasping and holding and applying forces in the flexion directions. So
where the lesion is in this patient?
Where was? It was in the plic, like in the corona radiata, so where most of the descending cortical spinal pathways goes down to the spinal cord.
So it's subcortical.
It's subcortical, yes. I will talk about analysis that we did between lesions locations and this finger dexterous movement. So at the first part, I will show you like how we quantified this individuation ability in human. And some hints about learning and generalization between different directions. And then I will show you some results about a recent study that we performed in sub-acute stroke patients with a focal lesion, showing some neurocorrelates between the individuation's ability in different directions. So we developed this ergonomic finger dexterity task, and the idea is like we can precisely measure the forces in each finger in each direction. So this is, you can put your fingers inside this device, it's isometric task, and then there's a force sensors for each direction and each finger, and then you just subject play kind of like a game in this task. So here they require to produce or to reach this force target by moving the index finger in the extension direction. So this extension, this is flexion, left hand, right hand, all of these fingers. So this is the one example for one try, and this is forces profile for the flexion of the index, and this is the forces profile of the index finger in the extension direction. Right? So we have a nice quantification of these forces, and then we can do the same for more complicated, more complex tasks, like producing multi-finger finger movement tasks. So this is an example by moving to the index and the ring while keeping all the other fingers immobile as possible. So this is the instructed fingers versus the uninstructed fingers, and this is what we measure. And then we came up with individuation index, like how we can quantify the ability to move a single digit without moving the other digits. So the way that we did that, we asked subject to produce forces to different levels of his or her maximum voluntary contractions. For example, I'm showing you here two examples for one participant when he required to reach 80% of the maximal forces versus 20% of the maximum forces. So this is a single finger movement. This is single finger movement, but I hope that you appreciate that when he actually required to move more forces, the other fingers moves as well. So this is unwanted forces that we actually produce when we move our fingers to reach higher force levels.
So the clarification, it's movement or just forcing?
It's an isometric task, so only forces.
Only force.
Yeah. So but they,
there's no movement.
No movement itself, no kinematics, just kinetic. Yes. So the way that we quantify, so the idea is that if we are perfect at individuating finger, this means that you precisely reach the target and then zero forces in the uninstructed fingers, right? This is not the case, of course, but this is how we quantify this. So we plotted in the y-axis the enslaving patterns, the enslaving forces, the forces of the uninstructed fingers as a function of how much forces they apply in the instructed fingers. And you see this is, for example, one digit single finger in the extension direction versus the flexion direction. So there is a nice linear relationship between these two metrics, but I think you can appreciate that there is much more enslaving in the extension compared to the flexion direction.
Is this trainable? Can you train a person to do, because extension of the fingers is not a very common thing that we do. We apply usually more flexion.
Right.
So can you ask people to train better and better?
Yes. I can show you that there's also learning curve. You can get better in both directions, and I will talk about generalization between these directions, also interesting questions. So when we quantify that, we looked at the slope of this line to just give some insight about the ability to individuate these fingers. The higher the individuation index, so we put the minus just to give it more intuitive metrics, that higher value means higher individuations. And when we do that, actually we found that, which is, I think, not super surprising, that among all fingers and the average across fingers, flexion is much more individuated movement than extension movement. Right? So we quantify that in the single finger digits movement and also in the multi-finger movement, and we get the same results here. What I'm showing you is this is example for 2-digit movement. So we have 31 combination in one hand. We have 10 2 fingers, 10 3, 5 4, and 1 5 fingers in one hand. All right. So together we have 31 combinations. We test all these combinations in different force ranges. And then we can, so instead of now looking at 2 dimension, now we look at 5 dimensions and trying to look at deviation of these unwanted forces compared to the target function, to the target force. And again, we found that we have much more error or deviation or less individuations when we compare extension versus flexion movement. So. If you really look at this kind of behavior, you might think, okay, which factors would affect this behavior, right? So we have the neural control, the neuromuscular control that sends some commands to move these fingers. But also we have lots of mechanical coupling. So we have lots of skin tendons between these fingers, right? And one of the questions is whether the differences that we found between extension and flexion is driven by some peripheral mechanical couplings, and not really there is a differences between the control of these two movement directions. So how we deal with this concern? So we did now experiment with a robot that can actually passively move each of these fingers in different direction. So when we move passively, we can record the forces that produce only due to the mechanical coupling. Right, because subjects were asked to just rest. There's no really control for any force target, and then the robot just moved these fingers.
Is it clear that they are not exerting any force by the muscle?
Yes, so I'll show you that. So we record the EMG again in the new cohort, just to confirm that it was really a passive movement, nothing with the EMG. So this is basically the task. So here the robot. It's a robot that moves the finger in different directions. So this is the extension of the thumb. Now you can see here it's a flexion of the index and etc. We also recorded EMG muscles, EMG activity from 6 different muscles, 3 in the extensors and 3 for the flexors, just to make sure, as said before, that there is nothing about the muscle activity. So when we look at this and we quantified how much forces these passive forces is due to the mechanical couplings, we actually found that passive coupling limits finger flexion to a larger extent than extension movement, which actually rule out that the differences that we found in the individuation between extension and flexion was not driven by these mechanical couplings, because we actually found the opposite, that we have more enslaving due to the passive coupling in the flexion. So when we move the finger in the flexion, we have much more forces due to this kind of tendons, skins in this direction. And this is what we propose here, that the difference is that between finger individuation and between flexion and extension is not really due to the mechanical couplings, but it actually has to do something different between the neuromuscular control between flexion and extension. So we also confirmed that we recorded EMG activity from these muscles, the FDM, FPP, FDS for flexion, and FDI, FDL, EGE for extension muscles. We also wanted to rule out that there is no stretch reflexes, because when you stretch the fingers, there is some reflexes. It's not super rapid movement, so it was a gradual movement. We found there is no really any movement, any EMG activity, and this is between the different fingers when we average across flexor muscles and extensor muscles, and we found there is no really any evidence that this forces that we measured during the passive condition were driven by some EMG activity due to reflexes. So really this suggests that something to do with the differences in the neural control between flexion and extension. Next we asked, as Ifat asked before, that can we teach people can we change these individuation indexes, right? And this is something that we just published recently, that I showed you that these directions are not overlapped, right? They are not the same. But then, are they fully independent, or they shared in terms of like control? They shared. They are partially shared. All right. So when you talk about partial, shared, you can think about they are symmetrically shared, or there is some biases to one of each directions, right? And this is we can make a nice prediction about these different hypotheses. If they are really independent, and so we predict that if you teach one group to make only extension movement, there should not be any generalization to the flexion movement. If there's a partially shared, so they are not fully independent, then you would expect to see some generalization between the directions. But the point is here, you also should find symmetrical generalization. So it doesn't really matter if you train flexion or extension, the amount of generalization should be similar across these two directions. And the partial and asymmetrical suggests that there is a bias to one direction. So the generalization is asymmetrical. There's still some generalization, but they are asymmetrical. Just to move quick faster, so Gili trained two different groups for 5 days in either the flexion or the extension direction, but then she tested them in both direction and then compared before and after training. Just to make the story short, we found that there is a partial generalization, but these generalizations are asymmetric across direction. Group that they trained in the extension, they improved the extension, which is something that we expected, right? If you train on something, you improve on that. But this group, also the same group, they generalized to the flexion direction. So when we tested them in the flexion direction after the 5 days of training, they also get better in the individuation in their flexion direction. They did not train in this direction at all during the training, right? When we did the same for the second group of participants, we found that flexion group, they improved the flexion, but they did not generalize to the extension. So you have no generalization. And this is something that we confirmed that wasn't driven by maybe one finger was more biased compared to the other fingers. It's something that we found across all fingers, that there's a kind of like uniform shift in the extension and the flexion and the extension, but not in the flexor group. For me, this suggests actually that I will skip this slide. I will go later. Yes?
Do you train on all fingers, or you have some testing that you train with some?
So we train them in all combinations. Yeah. I did a study before in my postdoc that we were trained only very predefined sets of chords, and we tested them for the new chords, and people get better also in the new chords. It's just, yeah.
And across hands?
And also there is a generalization across hands. Yes, we found. We did that, but I'm not showing here, between right and left hand. We tested only right-handed. So for me, just to summarize this part, there is, I showed you there is a differences between the individuation index, flexion, and extension, but also there is a difference between the generalization, suggesting that there is probably flexion biases that show this kind of interactive asymmetrical control between flexion and extension finger movements. Now I want to move to look at how brain damage in stroke patients just tells us something that we did not know before about the control of these finger movements. So OHAD, it's a collaboration clinical trial with Beth Levenstein that we recruited 32 right dominant stroke patients, and they are ischemic patients, stroke patients, and they are sub-acute, which means they are not in the chronic phase yet. So there's no really too much compensations processes occurred. They are 40, now they are I think 44 days after stroke. This is the age of these patients, and we also recruited healthy age-matched controls just to compare this individuation ability. What I'm showing you here is the lesion mapping. So when we put all these patients together, I'm showing you the heat map showed, I hope that you see this, but show this is, that we have much more and more participants that have lesion in this area, the click. There's, in terms of like lesions, this is, I would say, focal lesions, not all the brain, entire brain involved, which is in the following the stroke. So then we can, this is just the distribution of the lesion locations in these different areas, the cortical spinal tract, the precentral, and all of these areas. And now we can actually measure the behavior and then try to link the behavior with a voxel by voxel lesion mapping to the behavior. So in terms of the behavior, we know this from the clinic, that patients, they have deficit in their finger individuations. We know this, we just quantify this here. And then what I've shown you here is this is the same individuation index for stroke patients, and this is the control. So there is a reduction in the flexion direction and in the extension direction. So they have gets bad in these both directions. And this is something we know that the thumb and the index, they are the most individuated fingers because we use them lots and pinch all these things with these fingers, and the representation of these fingers are also larger than the other fingers. But I think that the interesting point is that when we normalize this impairment to the control, we observe that there's a significant difference between how much they impaired in the extension versus the flexion movement. So they get both reduction, but extension much more affected than the flexion. I showed you this in the same video with the patient. It's the same idea. But see, we quantify this.
So, when I worked on the spinal cord, there was this belief that there is a bias, extensor bias in the motor cortex and a flexor bias in the spinal cord. So, do you expect to have what was your underlying expectation? I mean, I would, to start with, expect to have a more effect on extensor due to cortical lesion.
Right.
And the question is this something that is still, is this the explanation that
you're
using for this?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I will talk about it later, but so there's a few fMRI studies show that try to, in healthy human, that try to do some kind of neuroimaging when people do flexion versus extension movement. And they found literally no difference in the primary motor cortex for encoding or representing these direction-dependent movements.
I'm talking about real science, not functional MRI.
Yeah.
People, what they have done is compare the organization of the cortical motor neuronal pathway versus the interneuron to motor neuron pathways. They found there is this bias. So
right.
It may be just that the fMRI will just be too coarse to identify between these.
So this study, I think most of them are during the recovery process after lesions to some areas, right? Or they basically found, I think...
Well, the study, no, I'm talking about non-human primates.
Non-human primates. No, I know, but there's the studies by Stuart Baker and these guys that did the lesion for the cortex, and they measured in the spinal cord level, and they found the same thing, that there's biases to one direction versus other direction. But in the cortex, but it's not clear yet. In the premotor cortex, how these fingers are encoded, whether there is another substrate actually that evolved in the flexion that in terms of behavior and mechanism and the neural control, I think when the learning generalization phenomena, we found it should be there's something biases to the flexion direction. Now, what drives these biases? I might show you something about it. I think confirm what you just said. So next, we took this lesion and tried to make a link between the lesion. So it's I would carefully say, I think this is kind of like a causal effect that you can better get in human studies, right? Maybe I'm a little bit biased, but it's hard really to get to some lesion in human to test the functions compared to non-human and animals and primates. So doing this lesion mapping in that early phase, before any compensation might happen and change the process and mechanisms, This is really, I would say, the closer that you can get to this kind of like lesion and causal effect of something that you disturb the cortex and see the differences in the behavior. So what I'm showing you here is, this is like a summary about when we look at the finger individuations in the flexion versus the extension direction. So we get significant, voxels that when there's a stroke in these voxels, this is the function that is impaired. This is the idea. And we found that in the flexion we have cortical spinal tract originating from M1, from the premotor cortex, and from the cortical reticular pathway. I think this is interesting that because this pathway goes to the reticular formation and then to the spinal cord, we have less in M1, and this is not because M1 is not involved, just because we don't have that much lesion in M1, in the gray matter of M1 in our cohort. And it's not very typical in stroke patients to get M1 lesion. And in the extension, we found that this is M1 CST and mostly M1 that involved in the extension movement. So this is just showing that, all right, these areas are important for flexion. But this doesn't really mean that are these voxels important only for flexion and only for extension, or important for there is an overlap bidirectional for these voxels. So this is what we did with the conjunction analysis, and I want to show really brief results about it. So in conjunction, we asked whether impairment affect only flexion or extension or both directions. And what we found is that in M1 and M1 CST, so there's a lot of bidirectional representation of flexion and extension. But we found that there is also some clusters within the cortical spinal tract that originate from M1 and from the premotor cortex and from the cortical reticular pathway that involve only for flexion movements. We cannot really find a big cluster. I think this is really very close to the noise ratio that is survived only explaining extension movements, right? To move in the extension. So for me, this means that voxels within the M1 and within M1 area 4 is actually involved in these both direction flexion and extension. Area within the premotor areas, we found there is some flexor biases in these premotor areas and CRP, cortical reticular formation. For me, suggesting that if we have a lesion in only the M1 and CST, you end with some input from the premotor areas and from M1 that have biceps flexion and this CRP, reticular pathway, that might allow us to do more flexion movements. So this, for me, at least explains why, for example, a stroke in part of this area would affect more the extension than the flexion. So we have much more resources that survive this, all this multiple comparison with the stroke lesion mapping analysis that actually were biases to flexion movements. So part of this actually pathway also might go to the reticular net, to the M1 CST, that could explain also that the biases that we observe at the level of the spinal cord for the flexors than that CST M1 biases to the extension. So basically, this is most of the things that I wanted to share with you. I talked more about cortical contribution to dexterity, but I think there's much more to do with beyond the cortex, beyond the so we know cerebellar patients, for example, they also have some deficit in making this finger individuation movement. This is a study from a German group that they basically measure individuation from stroke patient with cerebellar patient, and found there is a much more enslaving, much more unwanted forces in doing this very simple task. And the idea is that, well, the system is it's probably much more complicated than I just showed you. That it's not only the cortex that drive this movement to do this dexterous movement. There's a lot of loop that we just discussed before, the cerebellum and more subcortical, anatomical cortex that probably altogether they, I would say, controlling this this movement. I hope this is fine with you if that I'm showing that. So there's we are trying now to look more in depth about the involvement and contribution of the cerebellum in dexterous movement and finger movement, and in fact she has this very nice techniques that we can make high frequency stimulation to disrupt the output of the cerebellum and then measure the effect of this kind of stimulation on the behavior, and this is what we want to test. We just make a proof of concept, just tracking this kind of different monkeys from the performed task in the in the Proof's lab, showing that there is some deficits just by observing this the pattern and the trajectories of this movement. I think we don't have yet any forces, right, from the fingers that we can say something about this dexterous movement, but there is some deficit in the coordination at least, comparing HFS versus normal without any HFS, but it's just very premature and data, and I think we want to take this a few steps forward to more understand the cerebellar involvement in this finger movement. So with that, I think I want to summarize. I showed you that finger dexterity is dissimilar between the directions. There is direction dependent, was not driven by mechanical coupling, and it's more about the differences in the neural control of this movement. There is direction biases to flexion when we tested this generalization and learning across days in human. Using the stroke data and the lesion mapping, we show that that stroke impaired finger flexion and extension, but extension to much more to larger extent. And the VLSM, the lesion mapping, showed that there is a high overlap in the primary motor cortex, but there is some areas in the premotor areas and other area that were biased selectively to finger flexion movement versus other movement. I hope that at some point we will understand, the full picture that controlling this finger movement, but we'll leave this for future direction. And thank you for listening.
What about piano players? People that spend a lot of time in learning to control individual finger movement. Did you study this population?
Yes. So we studied this. So in the same. So we put it at first in the same paper that really we showed this, but it's still premature. We did around 15 pianists, people that they have really experienced years of piano. So there are very interesting results that, first of all, they start with much higher individuation ability than naive non-musician persons. This is for sure. In both direction, flexion and extension, they still have biases for flexion versus extension. But when we tested the same generalization across hands and across direction, they just generalize to both direction to the same extent, and also across hands. But this is a different story. But yes, behaviorally they are different in terms of representing or the ability to individuate finger in both directions, and also they learn differently and they also generalize differently. Yes, so it's a function of training. It's a function of experience. All of these things. We showed that we can change them by training. No doubt.
So thanks for the excellent. You speak about flexion and extension, but still, if you compare the functional role flexion extension of the digit versus more proximal, it is very asymmetric in humans, okay? Because we do precise movement from flexion and extension just to open it, where this is quite symmetric. So my question is, if you think that there is a difference between the fingers versus elbow,
It's a good question. I think it's the point that there is a differences in the neural control between digit flexion extension. It's a function of use. It's a use dependent. It's something that maybe by evolution that this kind of flexion is much more important for survival, of course, right? And then, but I don't think that extension is only for releasing. We sometimes need this precise extension. For example, if you ask a pianist, I ask her, So she knows exactly, how much she want to extend the fingers, not only for taking it out of the way, but no, she knows exactly which level she want to move these fingers, and this is why their individuation ability in the extension is much more improved. So this is a use dependent, this is a history dependent by evolution. My guess for this, more proximal, probably will be similarly controlled and representing the cortex. Yes, this is my guess, but I cannot test this. So maybe the cerebellum is involved actually in kind of like, out or in, out of the synergy or in within the synergy. There is some studies showing that you have dissimilar control, whether and I think it's an elbow or maybe shoulder movement. It depends.
No, still, in most stroke patients with this posture, okay, that we spoke in the past about the physiological extensor versus anatomical extensor.
Right. So what I can say about this is, in the clinics, these patients get good recovery in terms of like shoulder, much more or faster than the digits. So they still have this flexion synergy in the digits, but they can still move their. Actually, they compensate lots of more functions using the shoulder and a little bit of the elbow, but it goes like this way. This is recovered first, shoulder, elbow, and then this down.
According to your model, do you have any prediction about what will happen for patients with a premotor lesion that doesn't involve M1 in terms of the flexion extension bias?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think because there is, so this is the point, because there is some residual for the flexion in the motor cortex, I would say that even though you lesion the premotor area, you still will get some flexion individuations. That might be also involved in the strength. I did not show these results with the premotor that goes with the cortical reticular formation, right? Might see some weakness in the fingers, but in terms of like individuations, they still might have good recovery of individuations.
So people that have a premotor lesion recover, will they have, it will kind of, the phenotype will recover, but we'll see more enslaving, you think?
In one of the directions, yes. This is my prediction. Yeah. But it's really hard to find patients with, well, we can find, it's very rare to find a very selective lesion to gray matter in premotor areas.
So I think it's like it's not among stroke patients, but people with a tumor.
Right.
That then you have like a SMA syndrome, and there you have like
you can
more
find
isolated
more
premotor.
yes, more focal. Yes, I agree. That's a good point. Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.